Hey, everybody, this is Ben Bowman and Alex Titus. Welcome back to another episode of the Oregon Bridge.
They're not looking for somebody that says, here's the answer to your legal question. They want to know how they can solve the problem that prompted them to come to us in the first place. So we've always tried to look at ourselves as problem solvers and to recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for the kinds of problems that come our way. Sometimes the best solution is in the legislature.
All right, folks, we brought Alex Titus back off the bench for a very special podcast episode. Today, we interviewed Bob Steringer and Bill Gary, both of Harrang Long PC, which, as you know, is the sponsor of this podcast and sponsor of the Liftoff newsletter. But Bob and Bill are well-respected attorneys in their own right, and Harrang Long is actually a super interesting firm, as we talk about in this episode. But this is not a sales pitch episode, actually. There's a ton of we've been getting some really good feedback on our recent Oregon history podcasts about the 70s, 80s, 90s, Tom McCall, Vikati, etc. There's some very fun stuff in this episode about Dave Frohnmayer. Both of them knew him personally for decades. Frohnmayer worked for the firm. Bill Gary was featured on Wild Wild Country, the very popular Netflix documentary, because he was a central figure in the Rajneeshees crisis. He was Dave Frohnmayer's number 2 in the Attorney General's office while this was all going on. So we got some Oregon history stuff, but we also talk about the changing nature of the legal field and how Harrang Long has sort of been at the cutting edge of what that looks like. We talk about PERS reform, where they've been at the center of some of the most important and impactful PERS decisions in this state over the last several decades, and a lot of different things in between. But it was a fun episode to record. Alex, any thoughts or things for folks to look for?
Yeah, it was a great episode. I think, just a really interesting, something I'm really interested in particularly too, is just the convergence of law, business, and politics. And of course, their firm and both of them have been at the forefront of this, not even just in recent time, but I mean, basically working at that intersection for decades. And we also talk a little bit, I wish we got to talk more about it, but kind of the driving nature of lawsuits and politics and how the legal realm in general is just having a much bigger impact on political outcomes than it used to in the past. And of course, as Bob had a great answer to this, but it's always been there. But, they feel it's becoming even more prominent. I'm sure our viewers and listeners know that too. Lawsuits seem to be stopping everything, both on the right and left, really no matter what state that you're in. So, really interesting episode. And I mean, they gave a lot of insights both about law and then some really interesting insights of Oregon political history too. So.
Yeah, and before we jump into the episode, I did just want to say again our thanks to Harrang Long. Alex, you put out a notice a few months ago, sort of trying to feel out if folks were interested in sponsoring. And we heard back from a few folks, but Harrang Long was the first and the most excited to partner with us. So they believe in this product as a podcast. They believe in the newsletter. So we just want to say thank you to them for their partnership with Oregon360 Media. We really appreciate it. And with that, we hope you enjoyed this conversation with Bill Gary and Bob Steringer.
Harrang Long PC has always recognized that achieving our clients' goals sometimes requires a change in the law. And in other situations, clients need help stopping or changing proposed amendments to the law that put their interests at risk. For decades, we have played a role in shaping Oregon law on many subjects, from narrow regulations to major policy changes implicating billions of dollars. Our lawyers work with clients to draft legislation, prepare legal opinions and testimony to share with legislators, coordinate with professional lobbyists, and work directly with policymakers. To learn more about Harrang Long's policy and politics practice, go to harrang.com. That's HARRANG.com.
All right. Bob Steringer and Bill Gary, welcome to the podcast.
Good to see you.
Good to be here.
So, as we mentioned in the intro, you are sponsors of Oregon360. So first, we want to say thank you for supporting our company and helping us do what we do. And Alex and I have been excited about recording this episode for a few reasons. We're going to cover a lot of ground today because you all have been involved in some very interesting work. But before we get into that, we kind of want to start with what's the origin of your firm? Obviously, the name has been shortened. You're Harrang Long. But where did this firm come from? How did it get started?
So the firm dates back to 1957 in Eugene. It first opened in downtown Eugene on the second floor above a tannery. My partner, Jim Harrang, was one of the founders, and he used to talk about how every time he smells fresh leather, it reminds him of the good old days when work hours were 6 days a week. They went home at noon on Saturday, and the youngest, newest associate was responsible for sweeping the sidewalk outside the stairs that led up. They did divorces and minor criminal stuff, and formed businesses and all the sorts of things that go on in small towns, and kind of grew up with the city. By the time I joined the firm in 1989, they were setting out to try to do the best legal work on the most interesting cases and do it in Eugene, Oregon. And that's what appealed to me. I wanted the good stuff, but I wanted to have the quality of life of a small university town. So that's the origins of the firm. It's been through a couple generations now, and we're in the middle of another generational change as some of us more senior people head out to pasture.
Alex?
Great. Yeah, the next question that I wanted to ask was just, kind of more about the types of clients that you have, the types of services. Obviously, there's quite a lot of areas. If you just go ahead and look on the website that you do cover, it's quite I'd say a lot of areas of expertise for maybe I would say not a very small, but relatively small and mighty team compared to, say, maybe one of the bigger law firms. What does a typical client look like? What does a typical engagement look like? Imagine that can vary from some probably more bland things to some really interesting things that you thought maybe you never would have got into, or sort of cases you would have worked on. But what does that kind of look like?
Well, you're absolutely right about the variety of clients and the right variety of matters that we handle on a day-to-day basis across the three offices of the firm now. I think that we're probably most recognized for handling two types of matters. One would be matters that have some sort of connection with government or politics or public policy. And then the other category would be appellate law. And so if I can just kind of focus on those two things, and then I'll mention a few other things that we do. Our practice at the intersection of law and public policy a lot of times involves the representation of governmental entities. And over the years, our focus has been on clients that are local governments, special districts, school districts, colleges, and universities, as well as intergovernmental entities. And we help those clients with every sort of legal matter that they might encounter. Some of those matters are specific to governmental entities, things like public contracting or public records, open meetings law. And then a lot of it is the sort of work that we would do for any other organizational client, like employment work or real estate matters. I think where we probably have the most unique skills in the area of governmental representation is in the interactions between different governmental entities. And those interactions might be adversarial. We might talk at some point about, for example, cases that arise between local governments and the state government over public employee retirement obligations. But the interactions could also be collaborative. For example, well, a few years back, Bill and I got to help the community of Mosier in the Columbia River Gorge create an intergovernmental entity that they could use to collectively negotiate with Union Pacific after there was a train derailment there that caused quite a bit of damage in the community. So because we have this history of representing local governments and state governments, we're pretty well suited to help clients in those areas.
Dumb question before Alex, you follow up. An intergovernmental entity would be like city, county, water district kind of, all coming together. What does it actually look like? How does it function?
Yeah, well, state law allows local governments to form these, they start with the ability to enter into agreements with each other to allow all of the entities to collaborate to do any of the work that any one of them needs to do. They can also, through ORS Chapter 190, create an entity itself that exists in a way that is a bit separate from the entities that create it. And there's a lot of flexibility that's provided to local governments in doing that. Usually they'll create a board that combines the boards of the different local entities to work together to achieve whatever their goal might be. Using the Mosier example, that's exactly what happened. The three governments that were involved each appointed a number of people to a combined board that was responsible for deciding what they would do collectively.
That's cool.
That's really interesting, and I'm curious of, and I know there's that you all do quite a bit of work in terms of dealing with some of the different agencies, some of the different departments and things like that. But on that specific question, where I don't think you phrased it like this, but where maybe a state government or a city government entity might be at odds with a local government entity. That's really interesting. I guess something I hadn't even really thought of, but probably happens quite frequently. What are some examples of that maybe some interesting stories that you've had or some interesting cases on that front?
I think Bill, maybe you might want to talk about our involvement in PERS. I think that's maybe the best example of that.
Yeah, it's a fight that local governments have been having with state government since the late 1990s, at least. And this is a situation where the local governments, cities, counties, school districts, are basically required to be members of PERS, the Public Employee Retirement System, and they contribute money to the fund to fund the retirements of their employees. And they're required to join, and they operate under something that I call the Hotel California rule. They can check out anytime they want, but they can never leave. Once you're in PERS, you're there forever. And in the late 90s, there was a period of incredible growth in the stock market, and PERS was earning 15, 20, 25% every year. And the cost of the program to the employers, which is expressed as a percentage of payroll, in other words, you pay 10% of your payroll to PERS, kept going up and going up dramatically. 1% of payroll back in 2000 equaled $64 million. And they were seeing increases of 10%, from 10% of payroll to 20% of payroll. So that there was a lot of money, and that impaired the ability of local governments that have very little ability to raise taxes. What it translated into was fewer cops on the street, fewer teachers in the classroom, because they were funding retirement plan that had gotten out of control. They tried to go to the legislature. The legislature was totally uninterested in doing anything about it. And so we recommended that we initiate a lawsuit. And I was very clear at the outset that if you're going to sue PERS, you're going to lose. But if you lose in a spectacular way, you may be able to get the attention of the legislature for the problem. Turns out we ended up in front of an outstanding judge, Paul Lipscomb. We sued on behalf of the city of Eugene, city of Portland, Multnomah County, Lane County, several others. And Judge Lipscomb ruled in our favor. He held that the way that PERS was being operated was inconsistent with the statutes, and it was resulting in out of proportion benefits, and it was resulting in costs that under the statutes, the legislature couldn't legally charge to employers, local governments. That led to reform legislation that was passed in 2001. Governor Kulongoski introduced the bill as one of his first official acts when he became governor. It passed, it was challenged. The court invalidated some of it, upheld some of it. And over the last 20 years, there have been a series of decisions that have been issued by the Supreme Court, and the legislature has passed a series of reforms that began the process of trying to bring PERS back under control and making the costs reasonable. And so that's just one of many examples of where the state government and its local governments can end up at odds.
Was the core of the argument back in 2001 when you're representing basically like it was about the impact, like the impact of the structure of PERS was debilitating for local budgets, or was it what in layman's terms, non-lawyer terms, what were you arguing to the courts?
Well, PERS collects the money, and then the statutes provide for a benefit to the members. And there are three different ways that you calculate the benefit, and the member always gets whatever the highest benefit is under those three formulas. We argued that the PERS board had been doing basically two things wrong. They'd been miscalculating benefits, and they had been over-crediting member accounts with earnings. So for tier one members, the oldest members of PERS, they were guaranteed to earn at least 8% per year on their accounts. But when the fund earned 20%, the PERS board would credit 20%. And when the fund earned 0%,
it was 8%.
The PERS board would credit 8%.
So it's defined benefit, except for if you got more, then it was
exactly
a higher benefit.
And I've looked for years for investment vehicles that have that feature where you get all of the upside and none of the downside, and they don't exist. And the court held the trial court held that indeed they had been over-crediting member accounts, and that had resulted in the costs going up and benefits going well beyond what the legislature ever intended. In 2000, the average PERS retiree was retiring with a pension that was 106% of their working salary.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it was a lot more than that. And so it's been a process of trying to, through the legislature, where you can, contract the benefits so that you bring the cost down to a manageable level. But it's complicated because the court has held that the statutes that create PERS are a contractual promise to members. So you can't just go in and say, well, we're going to change the rules now.
Right.
You have to be a
It's
little
prospective.
bit more creative.
Yeah, it's like yeah. Well, as an OPSERT member whose mother was a tier 1 member, and knowing the difference between those two, I'm trying to decide if I should be blaming you for this or not. But we'll let it slide.
Yeah. You and a lot of other people. I remember I spent the first part of my legal career as a public employee in the Attorney General's office, and my friends are mostly PERS members, and some of them are still talking to me. But that comes with the territory.
No doubt.
And I will say, Bill, my mother, who is probably listening to this, clearly must have been following you with this case, because her language is almost verbatim with you. And she said, I can't find any financial vehicle that gives you the full upside with none of the downside. So in addition to the legal strategy that worked, clearly the PR strategy was working as well for my mother. But
Good.
But Bill, I think that's a great example of the next question that I wanted to ask, which was actually slightly a personal question I was just interested in, but I think fits your firm really well. The Wall Street Journal, usually like once or twice a year, will do kind of like an interesting deep dive on just kind of the law field in general. They've had a bunch of articles. One was about how at big firms, it's a lot harder to make partner now, and it's less focused on law knowledge, more focused on business development. They kind of have these different deep dives, which I think are really interesting. But one of them in particular was talking about how the legal industry is just changing a lot in general, from more sort of as, okay, I'm going to hire your firm to serve as counsel, to much more becoming, you are a counsel, but you are also a general consultant to us in a way as well, whether that be politics, business, finance, technology, whatever it might be. And of course, I think that fits really well into what you all do, especially just from that example that you had gave regarding PERS. I mean, I imagine when you're talking about both the financial side of it, the public policy side of it, also just frankly, the idea of saying we're probably going to lose, but we should do this because it might have this outcome, I think requires quite a bit of political savvy, political business, whatever you might want to call it, savvy, that a lot of other firms don't, probably offer in that space, which I think makes you all really unique. But help us kind of understand, like, is that a fair assessment of where you think the legal industry is going? Do you think that that's really helped, Harrang Long kind of shine above the others in terms of bringing that, of course, the legal expertise, but then also the outside political, finance expertise too?
Good question. I'm glad to hear, at least according to the Wall Street Journal, that our colleagues in other firms are coming around to the view that they have to deal with the client in a holistic way. Clients don't come to us with legal problems. They come to us with problems. And they have often a political aspect, a public relations aspect, a business overlay, and possible litigation or possible legislation that they have to deal with. And they're not looking for somebody that says, well, here's the answer to your legal question. They want to know how they can solve the problem that prompted them to come to us in the first place. So we've always tried to look at ourselves as problem solvers, and to recognize that, there's an old adage that if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail.
Yeah.
And we try to recognize that there is no one size fits all solution for the kinds of problems that come our way. Sometimes the best solution is in the legislature. Sometimes it's administrative. Sometimes it's public relations. And often it's all three or all of the above. And we like to try to make sure that our firm has a toolbox of things that we can bring to bear on a problem. So we have one of our attorneys is a full-time lobbyist, and we have good connections with firms that deal with crisis communications and the like, so that we can craft solutions to the problem that will get the client where they want to go. Often it's not by way of what they thought they wanted, but if you listen to the client and figure out what they are looking for and what they need, you usually can find a way to get them where they need to go.
So how does this work for, I've never been in this situation. Like, does a city manager or a mayor call you and say, hey, there's this train derailment, it was a disaster, we don't know what to do? Or do they come and say, we want to sue these guys, and then you say, well, here's another way to think about it? Like, how does it logistically work? I'm sure there's a lot of different iterations of what this might look like, but what does the beginning of a relationship look like?
I think a lot of times that first phone call does involve a potential client who right out of the gates wants to sue somebody because they're usually in the heat of whatever the issue is. And part of what we do is help channel that into an outcome that actually achieves their goals. I think Bill just described it pretty well. What we have to do at the beginning is definitely hear what the problem is that's being expressed to us, but try to draw out what sort of outcome the client would like to have. Because if we're not outcome focused from the beginning, we're likely to miss opportunities to actually achieve the best result possible. And so a lot of times, I think about this. I used to do a lot more work that was in more traditional business litigation, and what I came to learn is that most pieces of business litigation are really just opportunities for new business transactions. And so what you want to do as a business litigator is try to figure out what a corporate client wants to have as the outcome. And usually that's something that's going to be accomplished through some sort of settlement and new transaction, and probably cannot be achieved through litigation. So it's important that we really understand where we're trying to go, and then we assemble the team of professionals who can make that happen. Sometimes we can do that entirely in-house, but it's really important for us to have relationships with other professionals, as Bill just described, so that if we need to draw on expertise to fill in the gaps that we might have as lawyers, we're able to do that.
And I'm glad you brought up the litigation piece, because I did have one question for whoever who would like to take it. I know you've both been working in this kind of particular space for a long time, but has from your perspective, has the amount of litigation when it comes to political matters increased over the years? And I ask that because there's been, at least nationally, some think pieces, which of course always take for a grain of salt, saying that both the kind of political right and the left are using litigation more often when it comes to political matters. And I think a perfect example of this in Oregon was the Measure 114, which passed, different restrictions on firearms and things like that. And then national organizations, I believe it was the Gun Owners of America, came in, instituted a lawsuit in Harrang County. I don't know. I know it went to the Supreme Court a number of times, maybe even a number of different suits. But I mean, essentially, voters in Oregon passed a measure. An outside group was able to take this measure to the court. And from my understanding, there's still been no movement on the measure to this point. because of a very specific lawsuit that an organization, I think, very smartly put forward. And I think that kind of goes back to your example, Bill, when you said, well, we should try to, basically do the lawsuit, and then, maybe something might happen. If it doesn't, it might cause this. But have you been seeing that more often kind of in your work over the years, or has that always been happening? It's just gotten more attention kind of in the papers. Curious of your thoughts on that.
I think we are seeing more of that than we did before. I'm now 24 years out of law school, and I was heavily involved in politics prior to law school. And so I've had an eye on what's going on in that arena for quite a while now. I had always had it in mind that I'd be interested in combining those two practices or those two areas in one way, but there really weren't a lot of opportunities to do that, I would say, until the last, I don't know, five years, maybe 10 years, where I really think we've seen a huge spike in the use of litigation in connection with lawsuits, or litigation in connection with political matters. It's certainly not unique. There are historical examples of it. This firm, for example, was in the early 2000s was involved in litigation around Measure 37, which was a
land use
initiative that required compensation to people who could claim that their property values were impaired by government regulation. So it's not as if it didn't occur in the past. It just seems like everything right now that involves any sort of controversial political matter turns into litigation. That's good for us, I'd say, because we're really well equipped to help clients in that arena. Whether it's healthy for the civic environment may be a different question.
Well, so that is a really interesting question, and Bill, I'd let you jump in next. One consequence of this, and we see it at the national level, right, is the courts become more politicized, right? Like, because they have to decide on more inherently political questions. Is that the trend you're noticing?
I do think that there's a perception, at least, that the courts are being politicized, particularly federal courts. Depending on where you are, in what state you are, state courts have some of them have been political forever. Judges are elected, they run as Democrats and Republicans, and it's just the way it is. Oregon has a very long tradition of an independent judiciary, and even though we elect our judges, for the most part, they appear at least to be rather apolitical. One of the things, in addition to just the frequency, I think that has changed in this kind of litigation is that it is much more strategic, and people are much more sophisticated in the way that they approach it. You'll see lawsuits being filed in, a district in Texas because they think they're going to get a more favorable judge, and that judge might issue a nationwide injunction that stops some federal law in its tracks. There has always been political litigation. It's been, that's what I've done most of my career, in part because I started in the AG's office, and it, that's the kind of work that the AG's office does. But I think that it's become more contentious, and people have a much better understanding of how to use the system to achieve political ends.
That's actually a good transition to the next topic we want to talk about, which is, I think your time in the Attorney General's office. Was Dave Frohnmayer AG when you worked in the Attorney General's office?
Yes, Dave was elected to the office of Attorney General in 1980, took office in January 1981. I'd already been in the AG's office when he came in, but I then served as his Solicitor General and as his second in command, the Deputy Attorney General, until I left the AG's office in 1989. He insisted that he was going to run for a third term. I told him I hadn't signed up for a third term, but he did get reelected a third time and served into the early 90s.
So real quickly, well, actually, two quick just logistical questions here. Who was AG when you started? Who was pre?
Jim Redden was the AG when I started, and he left when he was appointed to the federal bench in late 1979. And the governor had to appoint his successor, but Republican Governor Vicatia didn't want to appoint a Democrat. And so he had to by law because
Right.
Redden was a Democrat. So he insisted that whoever he appointed agree that they would not run. And he appointed Jim Brown, who was a former district attorney and appellate lawyer in DOJ. And Jim had been in the appellate division, and the Solicitor General at the time did not impress him. And so his first official act was to fire the Solicitor General. And then he showed up in my little office in the trial division and asked me how I'd like to be Solicitor General for 6 months, because we all knew that whoever the new AG was going to be was going to bring in their own
Clean
person.
house. Yeah.
So I became Solicitor General. Dave got elected, and the first time I met him, there was a meeting of district attorneys that was held in my office, and the meeting broke up around noontime, and I went back to my office, and Dave followed me into my office and introduced himself and said, "Do you have time to get a bite to eat?" And because I was so politically astute, my response was, "No, I've got to get a brief out. I'm sorry." And Dave kind of looked surprised and left. And I put my head on my desk and said, "My career is over now." He decided he wanted me to stick around anyway.
Probably because he thought you were so hardworking that you had to go do this brief. Okay, so we're lining up a podcast actually to talk about the 1990 governor's election, which was between Frohnmayer, Barbara Roberts, Al Mobley, transformational moment in Oregon history in a lot of different ways. It was also Measure 5 election, which obviously set us on a course in terms of state finance. But part of what makes that story really interesting is, and I only got to meet him one time, which I regret, and I wish I would have got to know Dave Frohnmayer better. But the sort of mystique of Dave Frohnmayer was like he was the most popular politician in Oregon. He was he was kind of like the next iteration of the sort of like Hatfield, McCall sort of like moderate Republican. You know, he's, I think, pro-choice, which is what triggered Al Mobley's entrance into the race, which, you know, obviously the rest is history. I'm kind of curious as someone, and I should clarify, he worked for your firm later in his career, correct?
Yes, after he retired as president of the University of Oregon, he served for until his death as an of-counsel attorney with us. It's great. So, one of the great moments in my career was the opportunity to reunite with him and work with him on some pretty interesting cases.
I can only imagine. So I'm kind of just curious on an interpersonal level. Like, you obviously knew him in a different way than just him as a politician. Like, what was Dave Frohnmayer like? What was it like to work closely with him? What do you remember about Dave?
Dave was one of a kind, to be sure. What stands out, I think, to most people who have met him and dealt with him is his amazing intellect. It kind of made me nervous when I first started working with him, just being around him, because he was, 40 or 50 IQ points ahead of where I was, and he also had a very, very clear understanding of public service and what it means to be involved in government. And I think he convinced all of us that were working in the Department of Justice at the time that we were doing important work for the public. People today talk about the deep state. He used to talk about career public servants. And there are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of people scattered around state and local government still today who were disciples of Dave, worked for Dave during his tenure as Attorney General. And he made us believe that what we were doing was worthwhile and that we were valuable as part of the team. Working in those days in DOJ, even with the Rajneeshees and all of the upset, was a little bit like Camelot for me, and which is why I was so excited to have him join us when he was ready to come back and practice law again.
Well, that's I'm trying to decide how much more I want to talk about Dave Frohnmayer, but we also want to talk about the Rajneeshees. I just want to, I don't know if you have any thoughts of this, either of you, on this question. One of the first things I was a student at U of O, and someone sent me a piece he wrote. I think it was called I should have looked this up before the episode, but it's like the new tribalism or something.
Yes.
He wrote, it was like very prescient, and it was, I think, partially informed by his experience in the 1990 election, but also observing how politics shifted later. And it was basically about the increased polarization and tribalism that we see in the political space. And he is a perfect example of a politician who got caught in the middle of it, because he was not a tribalistic person, I think, by his nature or by his politics. But I don't know if you ever spoke with him or that, or have any personal reflections on that question.
So I think about that article quite often because, as you said, I think it was prescient. I think he saw the trend and where we were headed as a nation long before most of us did, and it deeply concerned him. On a personal level, the governor's race in 1990 may well have turned out the way it needed to for Dave Frohnmayer. As you know, he had family issues with his children that were very sick, and we often talked about how that election, both with the election of the governor, but also passage of Measure 5, kind of set Oregon on a course for the next 25 years. But on a personal level, it was very difficult to be the public figure that he was, and it would have been very difficult to be governor and also tend to the family needs that he had. He balanced it in a way that I always found remarkable. And I asked him one time, how do you do that? How do you cope with such overwhelming personal issues at the same time that you're dealing with the weightiest problems facing the state? And his answer was typical Frohnmayer. He said, if you think about it in gross, it'll overwhelm you. You have to chunk away at it. Just keep chipping at something until it gives. And eventually you can start making progress. And that was the way Dave approached it. I've talked with his wife, Lynn, over the years about what Dave would think about what has happened in politics in the country in the last 8 years. And it's one of the times when I look at the state of politics when I miss him the most. I think his voice is needed today, maybe more than ever.
Bob, did you get to interact with Dave at all? Were you at the firm when he was?
I was. Well, I volunteered on his campaign as a youngster in 1990. I was a fanboy, I guess.
No kidding.
What you'd say. And it was, as somebody relatively new to the political process, it was kind of crushing when he lost that election. I wasn't as tuned in, of course, to what that might have meant for him and his family, but for me, as somebody who also grew up in Medford, as he did, and who felt like he was just an incredibly brilliant and inspirational leader, it was hard for me to understand why my fellow Oregonians didn't all go the same way on that. So when we had the opportunity to have Dave join the firm, it was just a mind-blowing thing for me to have that happen 10, 15 years. Gosh, I guess it's even longer than that, many years after I had first
interned on the campaign.
Yeah. He's definitely the type of person and the type of lawyer that should serve as an example for anybody coming into the field now. And as Bill said, what's disappointing to me is about the current political environment is that I think that we've lost the ability to communicate with the sort of grace and nuance, I guess, that I always felt that Dave brought to issues. And that's, ultimately that seemed to be something that was used against him, frankly, in the 1990 election, that he had that sort of kind of nuanced and common sense approach to politics at a time when we were starting to see a turn away from that locally and across the country.
Well, this makes me really hopeful that we're going to be able to do a deep dive on the 1990 election, but we wouldn't have the personal connection to Dave that you both have. So thanks for sharing some of that. Bill, you alluded to a really important event. You said before we started recording that it wasn't fun at the time, but the Rajneeshee crisis, I guess you could say. We talked to Jim Moore about Vic Atiyeh as governor during this crisis and how Vic Atiyeh literally carried an unsigned executive order declaring martial law in Wasco County throughout the tenure. Like, it's just so hard to imagine today any equivalent of that. So Frohnmayer's AG, while this is happening, you're his number 2 in command. Decades later, you become an international celebrity because Netflix puts you on Wild Wild Country. What was your role? What was your sort of engagement with the Rajneeshees during this time?
Well, it was pretty all-encompassing. There was the thing that I think, to the extent that people are aware of the Rajneeshees today, I always forget that a lot of people in important positions weren't even, paying attention back in the 80s. But this was a group that created a commune in Central Oregon on a 64,000 acre ranch, and they built a city, and then they incorporated the city as a municipality. And at the end, it was exposed as a criminal conspiracy, and several people went to jail, and there were prosecutions and so forth. And I was involved in all of that. But there's another aspect of the whole relationship of Rajneesh to the government that I think is perhaps even more informative today. When you have a religion that controls a city, they owned all of the land within the city. It creates a series of problems. Cities, as we discussed earlier, literally interact with the state government in hundreds of different ways on a daily basis. Police training, access to law enforcement data, the ability to obtain police equipment that is not privately permitted, school, land use, and a host of other issues, revenue sharing. And these questions came at us from every direction. All of our agency clients had questions about how do we deal with the city of Rajneeshpuram. And Dave decided early on that we had to take a comprehensive look at that rather than trying to deal with it on a issue by issue basis. And that resulted in issuing an opinion that concluded that the city of Rajneeshpuram could not lawfully be incorporated and exercise government power because that violated the Establishment Clause. It was a violation of the separation of church and state.
And
we knew also.
Is that when they went after Antelope and said, okay, well, if we can't be our own city, we're going to go. Is that how that happened?
Yes. And beyond that, they intended also to take over the county. And that's the reason why they brought in thousands of homeless people so that they could vote, why they engaged in schemes to poison voters in the Dalles so that they wouldn't be able to show up at the polls. All of that sprung from the opinion that their city was unconstitutional. And obviously there was a lot of blowback, and we knew that our opinion was just our opinion. And so we went to court to have the court declare that it was unconstitutional. And Judge Helen Fry ultimately issued her decision agreeing with us and invalidating the city of Rajneeshpuram. And that happened, as these things do, just about the time that the entire thing collapsed. And people were being arrested and sent to jail for a period of time. The Attorney General and I and the governor and his staff and the U.S. Attorney and the Superintendent of State Police, we were having twice a day telephone calls.
Oh my God.
Just to make sure everybody was aware of what was going on. And you have to remember, this was happening just a few years after Jim Jones had induced hundreds of people to commit suicide in the South American jungle. So it was to us, it was a very real threat.
Is that what the greatest fear was? Like a mass suicide, or like Jim Moore alluded to this fear that the locals would sort of like take matters into their own hands and show up at Rajneeshpuram with guns or something? Like, what were your fears in the Attorney General's office?
Well, I think it was primarily the latter, that it would come to what would amount to a range war. from the locals who were seriously outnumbered. I mean, there were like 100 people that lived in Antelope, and thousands that were on the ranch. But also, the Rajneeshpuram was situated in a box canyon with one road in and out. And they had a police force that was heavily armed and was larger than most city police departments in the state. And we were at a point where we were talking about executing arrest warrants. And how you do that without having some kind of conflagration was a very great concern. Then they brought in people. They just started rounding up homeless people from Washington, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and brought them to Rajneeshpuram after it became clear that their attempt to take over the county wasn't going to succeed. I got a call from the governor's chief of staff one night at midnight, and she said, there are 3 vans driven by Rajneeshees, and they are driving through neighborhoods in the Dalles, dropping off homeless people 2 or 3 at a time, and they're flashing automatic weapons. What should we do?
What's the answer, Bill?
Like probably call the police. That sounds pretty bad.
Yeah, the police force in Antelope is like 1/4 time retired guy, probably.
Part-time volunteer. Yeah.
I can't say I remember the answer that I gave as well as I remember the question. It does stand out as the most interesting late night phone call that I think I've ever received.
So did you ever interact with the Rajneeshees? Like, did you ever interact with, or what was the interaction between the AG's office and I guess the leadership of the cult?
Well, it varied over the years. After the AG issued his opinion on the church-state issue, it was pretty much outright hostility coming from them. And before that, we tried to deal with them in a professional way. And we actually had some very interesting and good interactions. But the day that I argued the church-state case in Judge Fry's courtroom, she actually ruled from the bench in our favor. Everybody left the courtroom. I was packing up my bag, and Ma'anad Sheila, who was the leader of the Rajneeshees, said, "Oh, let me get the door for you." And she held the door as I was walking out of the courtroom, and she stuck her foot out and tripped me, and I fell flat on my face.
Oh my God.
That's what I remember about my interactions, personal interactions with Rajneeshees after the opinion.
I don't know if you can answer this question, and I'm sure so she like kind of avoided very much accountability for the very significant role that she played in all this. She's still alive, I think, living in Europe, doing whatever. But how did it come to pass that, like, you mentioned some people got arrested, some people I think were convicted, but it seems like the folks at the very top escaped accountability. Is that perception accurate?
Well, it's all in the eye of the beholder, of course, but she did get arrested in Germany and extradited to the United States, and she pled guilty and she went to prison.
She did, okay.
She did. And of course, Bhagwan was deported and died back in India.
Did you ever file charges against him?
We did not. The federal authorities did. They were taking the lead on the immigration issues, the fake marriages and that sort of thing. And our focus was more on the poisonings and attempted murders and those things. But I think that the perception that there was no accountability, it just isn't true. But given the fact that the things that were uncovered eventually, that are pretty well documented in the documentary that you mentioned, it's easy to understand why someone would look at that and say, how did somebody get away so lightly, having been so profoundly on the wrong side of the law?
I always do this. Like, I'm like, oh yeah, we'll be done by 5 o'clock, and then I get carried away. Last sort of meta question on this, Bill, and then Alex will close. I'm kind of curious what the Netflix experience was like, and how you alluded to this before we started recording, but how that sort of impacted your day-to-day life after you participated in it.
So I gave an interview to the documentarians and ended up being featured in this, I think, 5-part series. When it came out, I'd forgotten about it. It was not a particularly significant event to have given the interview, but I started getting calls from people all over the country that I hadn't heard from in 20 years, telling me that they'd seen me in this documentary. And I think I mentioned my oldest daughter was little at the time, and when she saw the documentary, she suddenly had interest in my work for the first time in her life, and she said, "Gee, I had no idea you were doing things other than just being my dad." And that's been the fun part of it. As I said, it was no fun doing it in real time, because it seems so consequential and the stakes seem so high. But looking at it in retrospect, I can now look at it and say, boy, that was pretty interesting stuff.
No kidding. Alex?
Very interesting. Yeah, I remember I was in DC at the time, and I'd meet people and say, I'm from Oregon. They'd say, Oregon, the Rajneeshees. And I'm like, really, everyone has seen this Netflix documentary. So yeah, I'm sure it's quite something to look back on. So wanted to ask you two more quick questions before we let you go. The first question I'll give to you, Bob, is just wanted to ask before we close, what's in store for the future of Harrang Long? So, of course, we had the recent name change. We know that there's been a couple of new partners or shareholders that have joined the firm. What is the future of the firm like, and what's kind of the direction, or where are you hoping to take the firm maybe in the next 5 years?
Sure. Well, one of the things that we're very intent on doing is protecting the type of practice that we've had for 30 plus years now, occupying this space that we describe as being at the intersection of law and public policy, politics as well. We have through this experience been able to handle some of the most complex and consequential matters in Oregon history, while maintaining a pretty small firm culture of collegiality and teamwork. Colleagues like Bill continue to do extraordinary work, training up the generations behind them, and deepening our client relationships to make sure that we continue to provide clients with the quality of service that they've come to expect. So, of course, one of our goals is to see that transition through, to ensure that we remain, renowned as a firm in matters that involve law, public policy, and politics. In addition to being Oregon's, in my view, preeminent firm for appeals and the complex litigation and regulatory matters that often lead to appeals. And then at the same time, Harrang Long has always been firm with a diverse array of lawyers and practice areas, and we're always looking to broaden and deepen the services that we can offer our clients by bringing new lawyers into the firm. Alex, you mentioned that we have recently brought in a number of busy litigators. That's been a really exciting addition to our practice, and we remain we continue to seek out and invite interest from other lawyers who might have an interest in being part of the team at Harrang Long going forward as we make, set ourselves up for another 65 years of law practice.
That's great. No, thank you for that. And then the last question I'll ask for you both, which is generally the easiest, is, if folks want to go ahead and get in touch with you, or if they want to reach out and learn a little bit more about the firm and some of your services, what would be the best way to do that?
There's another Netflix documentarian who wants to get in touch. Where should they go?
Well, the easiest place to go is to our website. That's www.harrang.com. Harrang is Harrang. You can also find the firm on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. And my Twitter handle is @Steringer Law. That's STERINGERLAW.
All right.
We will try to link to we've talked about a few things that over the course of the episode. So hopefully folks will be able to find some handy links in the show description. But we just want to say thank you to you both for coming on the pod, but also for believing in our little startup company here and being the first to step forward and be an advertising partner with us. It's meant a lot to us and helped us do some new things. So we really appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
Well, I've been a longtime listener to the podcast since you guys started. We really do appreciate what you're contributing to the dialogue in Oregon. So thank you for what you do.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you back here next week.